Welcome again to today's webinar. My name is Emily Gray, and I am a postgraduate researcher at the University of Galway in Ireland. And together with my colleagues, Francis Fahy, also from the University of Galway, and Kinga Kovac from Energy Cities, as well as our guest speaker, Dr. Jean Moore, we're really pleased to lead today's webinar on governing the European Green Deal, how local experiments can help. Thank you so much for joining us again. So this webinar is part of a project called Shared Green Deal, which is a 5-year Horizon 2020 funded project that has undertaken shared actions to achieve the goals of the European Green Deal, informed by social sciences and humanities tools. So through 24 social experiments across Europe, which you can see in this map, we tested ways to address the European Green Deal's goals of clean energy, a circular economy, efficiency, renovations, sustainable mobility, sustainable food, and preserving biodiversity, all through community actions. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. We analyzed all 24 social experiments on the theme of governance, and today we're going to present some of the findings from this analysis. And these findings are available in a more detailed form in our report, which was launched on Tuesday, Governing the European Green Deal Through Local Social Experiments. And you can find plenty of examples, a lot more description in that report. So please definitely take a look at that if you're interested in anything that we mentioned today. So in the next 30 minutes, we're going to explore how the European Green Deal is being governed at the local level through social experiments, specifically through the social experiments that have been part of Shared Green Deal. And we're going to look at what the Green Deal means to local actors, what kind of governance innovations they implemented through this project, and what happens actually when we do things differently. And we will talk about some of the things that got in the way of the effective governance of the Green Deal in this project, and share some recommendations that we have for other people who want to undertake local social experiments, and also for policy research and funding. And this will be followed by reflections from our guest speaker, Dr. Jean Moore from the National Economic and Social Council in Ireland. And after the webinar is over, we'll have time for some questions. All right, so just to give a little background about what we're talking about when we're talking about governance, because it's one of those words that has a million definitions. And we wanted to understand what we could learn from Shared Green Deal about the governance of this big policy, the European Green Deal. So Shared Green Deal is based on this concept of social experiments, by which we mean learning by doing. So our partners in the 24 different locations were undertaking different interventions and learning along the way. And we consider this experimentation. And these social experiments themselves can actually be considered a form of governance. If we look to definitions of governance like global climate governance and experimental climate governance, which I have here on the slide, but which are really getting at this sort of the fact that experiments are not just standalone interventions, but they're part of a whole fabric of governance activities that are constantly ongoing, evolving, and seeking sort of to improve the situation with relation to climate change or any other kind of challenge that's being faced. These experiments are particularly happening at the local level, and we consider that social experiments can actually help adapt governance agendas like the European Green Deal to the local level through actively engaging actors in understanding what these agendas mean for their daily lives and how they can concretely address the challenges that they face in terms of sustainability or climate change. And this is all done through this social experimentation, or learning by doing. So Shared Green Deal had 6 streams following major priorities from the European Green Deal, with 4 social experiments per stream. And each of these streams used a different social sciences and humanities tool as the sort of foundation of their social experiment. So for clean energy, they used community visioning, which is a process that brings people together to imagine a desired future. In the circular economy stream, they were working with local accelerator hubs, which was a physical and online interactive space to connect stakeholders and enable the experimentation, piloting, and scaling of different innovations in relation to circular economy. The efficient renovations knowledge networks were multi-stakeholder groups who shared a common interest in learning through doing. In the sustainable food stream, they were doing food transition assemblies, which was a collective process of understanding, learning, visioning, and experimenting around the challenge of food. In the sustainable mobility stream, they had school mobility labs. So these were kind of real life testing environments where school communities were involved in designing, testing, co-creating, and actually adopting solutions to the mobility challenges that they faced. And in the preserving biodiversity stream, they were doing study circles, which are non-formal, experiential, collaborative, and self-directed approaches to learning in very participative discussion groups about biodiversity in different local contexts. We really focused in our analysis on the perspectives of the local organizations who were running the social experiments. So we focused on data sources coming out of the project, where the local organizations shared their own observations and reflections both during and after the social experiments. I just wanted to show the map of our experiments one more time. So you can see that these experiments were happening over a very wide geographic range, facing all kinds of different challenges. We started our analysis from trying to understand what kinds of governance challenges the social experiments were trying to address in each location. So how did our partners in each of the 24 locations frame the European Green Deal? And we found that they mostly framed it in terms of local problems. And we found 7 specific challenges across all of the 24 social experiments that our local partners were trying to address. So the first one was environmental and health conditions. And this was a challenge that all 24 local partners actually mentioned wanting to address. So this is the foundation for wanting to engage in these social experiments. But in addition, some of the other problems that they wanted to address with, or challenges rather, that they wanted to address with their social experiments were things like a lack of education and awareness about certain sustainability challenges, or the fact that environmentally friendly options were perhaps economically unsustainable, or that there were certain groups that were socially or economically vulnerable that didn't have access to more sustainable options. Another challenge that was faced by our local partners was unsustainable social practices or individual behaviors. Other partners noted that there was a lack of inclusion and participation in ongoing efforts to tackle the challenges that they wanted to address, or that there was disconnected kind of network of actors. So people who needed to get together to address the problem weren't connected for whatever reason. And finally, some of our partners had the challenge of policy gaps. So where policies didn't actually address the challenges that they believed needed to be addressed. So through the Shared Green Deal social experiments, our local partners tried to address these challenges, and their efforts to do so took the form of one or more governance innovations. We identified 4 main types of governance innovations that arose in Shared Green Deal as participants tried to use these different social sciences and humanities tools to address the local challenges that they connected to the European Green Deal. The first one was education innovations, which are activities that changed the ways in which people learn about sustainability challenges and solutions. The second was relational innovations, and these were activities that reconfigured relationships. They connected actors across sectors, for example, and other types of connective work. The third was organizational innovations, and these were activities that rearranged organizational structures or enhanced the capacity of actors. And finally, we identified policy inclusion innovations, which seek to change how actors contribute to formal policy making, both in government institutions or in other kinds of institutions like schools, to include, or perhaps to include new actors in policy. So I will now present a few examples of each innovation. So for each governance innovation, I have selected one example, and I just want to highlight that even though I'm using that example to show that particular governance innovation, most of the experiments actually had multiple governance innovations that were part of them, and I just want to use one to illustrate. The first example is of an education innovation. So the Preserving Biodiversity Study Circle in Tolmin, Slovenia, led by Posoški Razvojni Center, introduced study circles as an informal education opportunity for adults to learn about the nature around them, as you can see in these photos. The group directed their own learning, and they chose to study local birds and ultimately to create a garden to educate the entire community on local biodiversity. And after Shared Green Deal ended, they continued with a second study circle to learn more about how to run and maintain their community garden. An example of a relational innovation comes from Mayo County in Ireland, where the Efficient Renovations Knowledge Network, led by an organization called CALL, and supported by Mayo County Council, wanted to increase the number of retrofitted homes in their area through raising awareness about the benefits and the ease of renovations. And they brought together residents and professionals to share practical knowledge about renovations. They toured homes that were soon to be renovated and those that had already been renovated to really learn about the realities of renovation. And they developed relationships with each other and really networked with professionals, renovations professionals, and they plan to keep this network alive so they can keep sharing information and practical knowledge to help increase renovations. One example of an organizational innovation comes from the Circular Economy Local Accelerator Hub in Val-de-Marne, France. They worked with the local textile sector to rethink the textile life cycle and how they could make an impact locally. They used different design thinking exercises, and this experiment helped the fashion and textile industry professionals, as well as residents and community members, identify the need for a community-based tailor. And they actually launched this neighborhood tailoring service, which was intended to help reduce the need to buy new garments and make this process of garment production more sustainable. They secured actually additional sponsorship. So this tailoring service has been able to help make it easier for people living in this area to have their garments repaired. So this keeps them out of landfill and ultimately reduces the production of clothing, but it also generates income and facilitates relationships and positive social interactions in the neighborhood. Finally, one great example of a policy and inclusion innovation comes from the Mobility Lab in Braga, Portugal, where the municipality of Braga engaged school communities and especially students in discussing how to get to school more sustainably. And they used lots of different fun methods like creative arts, and ultimately wrote recommendations for safer, healthier school journeys. And these recommendations led to the implementation of specific measures. So a new pedestrian walkway in front of one school, fewer parking spaces in front of school buildings, and more students using public transportation. And the municipality also created a program to help children learn how to ride bicycles, which they discovered during the lab that many didn't know how to do. So they are also planning to replicate this in other schools because there was a lot of interest based on this, this one project. So of course, experimentation is a difficult process because there's so many uncertainties inherent in the process of experimentation. And we noted a couple of barriers that were shared amongst many cases. So for example, experiments are quite short, and that in our case, they lasted 1 year. So this was noted as a potential barrier to their effective kind of governance of the European Green Deal at the local level. A lot of the partners had to get creative to find funding and resources for follow-up programs, and these were oftentimes considered necessary. And then finally, the degree to which the experiments could be embedded in existing social and community structures really determined how effective they could be long-term. So in some cases, people were working in really hard to change sectors, such as the energy sector. The availability of necessary infrastructure, for example, proper or sufficient kind of public transportation lines in certain cities weren't available for students. So sometimes the recommendations were not able to actually be implemented. And then connections with policy and government decision makers also sometimes made it difficult to embed the experiments if these links with the formal kind of policy and government were not very strong or clear. Nevertheless, we wanted to share a few recommendations about what makes social experiments effective as governance mechanisms based on our analysis. So first, we think we found it's important to frame the problem and frame the problem in terms of local challenges, and also thinking about framing them in terms of the social challenges in order to address the more technological, environmental, or climate change issues that are being faced. It's important to also strike a balance between creativity and experimentation, and also being intentional and managing people's concerns about uncertainty. So being flexible, but also being clear about what people can expect, giving people a degree of ownership or decision-making power in the process, and really focusing on building relationships, as this is one of the big major things that positive outcomes that can come out of a social experiment. Embedding the experiment in existing governance is really important for a social experiment to have sort of a longer lasting life and make a bigger impact. And finally, having trusted support, whether that be within the community, with other co-creators who can really help push the experiments forward and help solve problems, or outside of the community, where you can kind of troubleshoot, exchange experiences, can be really helpful. And that was really helpful in our project, as we had people all over Europe who were doing social experiments at the same time. Very quickly, just a few recommendations for policy researchers and funding that are a bit more general. We recommend that policymakers incorporate support for local efforts to govern the European Green Deal into policy explicitly, and that they work with local experimenters to create a social experiment support body that has that support from kind of formal governance and policy. We also recommend that researchers help partners embed the social experiments in their larger context. And we think this is something that researchers could be well placed to do, paying attention to the kind of very specific local knowledge, very valuable local knowledge that these partners have. And finally, funders can help by financing local projects, ensuring sustainable experimentation by thinking about that kind of short-term, long-term life cycle, and considering diverse measures of success for projects that are working on an experimental basis. So you can read more about these findings in our report, which was released yesterday, and definitely check out the Shared Green Deal website and follow the work of all of these wonderful local organizations that we've been working with that are working hard to govern the European Green Deal. Next, I would like to introduce our guest speaker, Dr. Jean Moore from the National Economics and Social Council in Ireland. Dr. Jean Moore is a social and environmental policy analyst working on climate, energy, biodiversity, and sustainable development projects. And I will let you take it from here. Thank you so much for being with us today, Jean.
Thanks so much. It's lovely to be with you. Good morning, everyone. So I'm in Dublin at the moment, and as Emily says, I'm Jean Moore, and I'm with the National Economic and Social Council. Next slide, please. So NESC is a body that advises the government in Ireland, the Taoiseach, the Prime Minister, providing research, dialogue and advice that helps achieve Ireland's sustainable economic, social and environmental development. So we work to support and shape sustainable, resilient, inclusive, and just economic, social, and environmental development. And so this gives us a kind of clear overview of many of the strands of the European Green Deal as they come to Ireland. So we try to kind of provide trusted policy advice, but we also have a strong focus on a deliberative element. So we have a council made up of unions, business, environmental NGOs, community and voluntary sector, independents, government representatives. So it's a very, I suppose, apt organization to be able to reflect on this work. And we're also, just to say, we're part of some European networks of economic and social councils and also of environment and sustainable development advisory councils. Next slide, please. So really, I just wanted to flash this up just to say that we've been trying to embed sustainable development into our work over the last decade. We've done a range of work that looks at, for example, climate change and biodiversity, did a piece on natural capital accounting, or our biggest piece of work around connecting people to the energy transition and different elements of that. We've looked at just transition, transport, urban development, rural development and agriculture, and a range of projects on well-being, environmental data, circular economy. So again, we would have that sort of substantive focus on some of these really important policies that come to us from the European Green Deal. Thanks, Emily. Next one. So I really welcome the focus of this research and this report. I welcome the focus on creating spaces for change, which foster the European Green Deal policies locally. And I think this emphasis on social innovation is often absent. And I think in getting under the bonnet, I'm particularly interested in the governance processes from EU to local level and how that really shapes how things are implemented and where there is innovation, where it fails to maybe scale up. And I think recognizing the challenge of social innovation and how we often want to look at examples that are innovative, but we don't quite know how to embed them into policy and practice. And I think this report really is helpful to try and understand some of these key pieces. And for me, some of the takeaways are how we recognize, strengthen, and embed local learning by doing, but also how we look at local, national, EU policy and how we build capacity in those for transformative change, because we can support innovation on the ground, but then are we able to absorb it and become transformative? And when we look at policy being delivered or implemented on the ground, sometimes the way these processes are translated from EU to national, the learnings, we often find that this process is mysterious and underexplored. So this work is really important. Next slide. So in terms of the NESC work, we've used the term experimental governance for a number of years. We were very heavily influenced by the work of Professor Charles Sable in Columbia University. And this approach acknowledges that those seeking to bring about change must confront, rather than assume away, practical, economic, and social and technological barriers. So experimental governance relies on trust and actively seeks to nurture it through a commitment to evidence, open review, and policy development based on experience. So it's a wider system than just supporting innovation. It's how you actually embed that learning. And this particular work focuses on climate experimental governance. And it's really important that we delve further into this, how this approach can be embodied into the wider policy system. And we've seen local innovative projects receiving EU funding to deliver some of these European Green Deal objectives, but often the learning, once these are completed, is not captured, not shared widely, and projects end, as Emily has pointed out. So the report recognises we need a more nuanced understanding of how the experiments become embedded in governance structures and lead to long-term change. And this is particularly important when we're supporting transformative change, which, as we know, is so critical at the moment in the face of climate change and biodiversity loss. So I wanted just to very briefly mention a couple of examples from our work. The first one is around learning from COVID, where the council produced a report that talked about lessons of innovation from the pandemic, when really the rules were out the window and everybody had to just get on with it. And one of the conclusions from that report is this idea of the willingness to step up and step in, how we want to see that sort of innovative practice happen, that was a recommendation. And we would say probably that's probably not happened broadly because there is a hesitancy in policymakers to take risks with innovative practices. And so we often face implementation and delivery challenges for a range of projects. In Ireland, for example, it's around ambitious infrastructure renewable projects. And this points to the importance of building capacity to harness frontline knowledge, as well as the evidence from the research community and from elsewhere, to revise plans and actions accordingly, to establish a shared understanding of the vision and direction, which can really help counter the business as usual approaches. So the second example is around place-based initiatives, and some of our work has looked at some of these agriculture and environmental projects supported, for example, by the LIFE program. So the European Innovation Projects, EIPs, and LIFE projects on water, biodiversity and forestry. In Ireland, a famous one is the Burren Farming LIFE project, and how these innovative projects are often that we don't get to learn from them and how we need to scale them up. And it really highlights the importance of locally led teams working with farmers and communities, a key part of success. And some of the outcomes from that analysis was we need to be better capturing the data from some of these innovative practices and the results, as well as ensuring coherence in policy and wider governance to better scale up these practices. And our report, the Council produced a report on just transition in agriculture and land use, and it found that with sufficient support, there is real potential for innovation and learning to shape the revision of future best practice standards and policies as part of a responsive governance of transition. The interaction between national policy and process and I would say European and bottom-up initiatives will be important to both align local processes to national and European targets, but also to ensure that the evidence in practice shapes future policy. So it's a kind of an iterative feedback loop that we really need. And then the last example is energy communities, piece of work I've just been working on. And really that looks at innovative projects, very much like the Lewisburg network that was cited as an example in this work, as an example of relational innovation. And the council recommendations around energy communities point to the need to share best practice, to build these peer supports with energy communities, and whether that's through renewable energy projects or supporting retrofits in disadvantaged communities. There are really interesting innovations, but they don't progress after the funding ends, and they remain disconnected from each other. And so this important work highlights the role of networks to share and build on the knowledge, and this is really important. Last slide, please. So I would suggest these recommendations in this report on improving governance of the Green Deal, embedding experimental governance, could have wider positive impacts to all areas of policy and governance, and that they could be policy system bridges. For climate change in particular, we know these are critical. We need to get better at learning from innovative local projects at this critically important time if we are to find effective approaches to reduce emissions and address biodiversity loss that work at a local level. This report notes that flexibility and reflection are key for social innovations, but I'd say they're also critical for policy and governance to ensure innovations and transformative change can be embedded. But we know that there are barriers to change within policy and governance at all levels, requiring a focus on when and how social or wider innovations to support the European Green Deal are effectively embedded. How and what happened that didn't happen for other innovations. It's really good that we maybe have more research on that. We know that collaborations and networks are critical to share learning, to empower local actors and build bridges. Also important is to bridge across social, economic and environmental innovations, to bring new synergies and learning and support cross-boundary collaboration across countries, between national and local actors and across disciplines. And another notable, more widely applicable recommendation in this work is to engage in the conflicts, diversity of perspectives and relationship dynamics of social experiments, rather than focusing exclusively on effective project management. And I think this point that's noted in the problem framing around disconnected actors really resonated with some work that we've been starting to do on social cohesion. And we will be hosting an event with the EESC as part of Ireland's holding the presidency of the EU next year, looking at social cohesion and more focus on understanding the diversity of perspectives, the context, the social and personal experience of people, including how they feel, requires greater focused participation and deliberation. So I'll stop there, but really welcome this piece of work and looking forward to the discussion. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Jean. That was really fabulous. Wonderful reflections. Really great to hear your perspective. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. We will kind of formally close the recorded part of this and the sort of formal part of the coffee talk